With the draft right around the corner, let's chat with our pal Joe Goodberry and try to read some Bengals tea leaves.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm Jake Lisco. He's James Rapine. We're joined today by Joe Goodberry from First Star Logistics, Bengals on the Brain, former co-host of the Locked On Bengals podcast, of course, as well, formerly with The Athletic and Bleacher Report, and the resume goes on and on for Joe. We're going to be chatting about what we think is going on at Bengals HQ as we try to read some tea leaves in today's episode. Brought to you by Monopoly Go, which you can download right now for free on the App Store or Google Play for a mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. And guys, let's talk about what we think is going on with the Bengals this year. We've talked a lot about it, obviously, but as we get closer and closer, we've learned about Johnny Newton having a visit. We perhaps haven't talked enough about cornerbacks. Let's get into some of these discussions that maybe we should be paying more attention to. James, where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with Johnny Newton, because I think Johnny Newton is the most famous Bengal that potentially never was, or maybe will be on Thursday night. And I think that the visit, Joe, that you reported kind of opened up the possibility of him being their first round pick. And Byron Murphy certainly picked up steam. It sounds like he's going to go top 10 or not make it to the Bengals. And who knows, maybe he does. But if he doesn't, how realistic is it, do you think, that Johnny Newton's in play at 18?
I think it's very real. I think there's a lot of ways you can spend those top 30 visits, right? You can say, hey, we need to check on this guy's character. We want to check back in on a guy we met earlier in the process. We want to check in on how a guy's feeling off of injury, which I thought immediately was probably the idea with the Johnny Newton, right? Like, he had that foot injury. He wasn't able to work out at his pro day. Let's see how he's doing and get our hands on him, talk to him face to face. But as I DM'd Johnny Newton back and forth on Twitter, it sounded like that it went very well, and it was a very positive and a very hopeful first round meeting type of thing, like a very real, let's put him on the board. And when we did our board, when we did the show, last week on your channel, James, we were like, do we put Johnny Newton in the 1C, like that first guy in the 1C? Is he a trade back or a disaster scenario where, 17 of the guys we wanted in the first round are gone and we've got to dip into this pool? Or is he one of the last 1B players? I still don't know the answer to that, but I feel like it could be one of those two, and that he's on the cusp of being in consideration depending on how the board goes. I do think they want to address defensive tackle, not just for the immediate. I don't think he's a nose tackle, right? If you're using the nose tackle position to say why they should take Byron Murphy or Johnny Newton, they are not that. But I do think they want some more pass rush juice on the inside while also looking at the future with BJ Hill being on a 1-year deal. Newton makes a lot of sense on film and with the data.
Do we think that he's still behind the tackles? I mean, I guess that's kind of what you're saying. Back of 1B, top of 1C being the different tiers, the different parts of the first round, 1A being the top of the first round, 1B being the middle of the first round, 1C being if we have to trade back or all the guys we want are gone kind of thing. Or perhaps some of those tackles or guards and the Bengals would have Newton ahead of them.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. It sounds like the league is high on this offensive tackle class. I would expect the Bengals to feel very similarly, right? And as we're getting close, I'm seeing these mocks. I just saw one today where it had 6 offensive tackles go before the Bengals were on the clock. I think 9 total in the first round. And I'm like, okay, so there's a part of the scenario we're going to talk about in today's show is like, okay, what if you get there and there's not an offensive lineman? Or what if the Bengals view Troy Fautanu as a guard, right? What if they view Fuaga as a guard? Would they spend the 18th pick on a guard? I'm not so sure, right? I don't, based on their history and how they do things, I feel like they would say, no, those guys can be tackles. Yeah, maybe they'll play as rookies and could challenge Cordell Volson at the left guard spot. But once you get into those waters where you have to decide how a guy is even going to play, I think that lessens their value just a little bit. And if you go back and say Johnny Newton was a top 12 to 15 player when we started this process, I think that still holds weight for the Bengals. I think when they get their scouts grades at that point and that guy is ranked really highly, sure, he had a quiet draft process. He had that foot injury, didn't do any of the all-star stuff, didn't do the combine or the pro day. He wasn't putting his visits out there on social media like some players were. He had a lot of visits, it sounds like. I think teams are probably more interested and less the health concerns are a big thing. But I think, just based on what they saw in their grades, I think Newton probably is a top 20 or so player on the Bengals board. So it just depends on the scenario.
Yeah, and he should be. And what I think is interesting is if you go value-wise, I totally get why they would look offensive tackle first, because you're right. And maybe they get one, but they're going to fly off the board. And the quality of player that you get at 49, or if you wait till round 3 to get an offensive tackle versus what you're getting at 18, the drop-off could be very, very real. At the same time, I think they would say that the drop-off at defensive tackle from a Johnny Newton to whatever you're getting day 2 is greater than taking a guard at 18. And so I don't even think that they would entertain that, honestly. I think there would be, and we can get into the other positions, but I think Johnny Newton would easily win that tiebreaker if it's Troy Fautanu, the guard, versus Johnny Newton. If they're 17 and 18 on their board, let's just say they're that close, I think Newton wins the tiebreaker because of the need, just having another defensive tackle that would be under contract for at least 4 years, probably 5 years, would give you some more pass rush. And what's today's game? How valuable is it to have someone like that can wreck a game? It's more valuable. And I think the Bengals would view it as more valuable than a guard, especially because this interior offensive line class is deep-ish when you get into rounds 2 through 4.
Yeah, before we had the report of the visit with the Bengals, I think we were putting Johnny Newton on the back burner of like, everything's just been too quiet. Let's push him back with someone we all still like, but we just don't have a feel for where he's going or where teams are viewing him. So we'd always have like Joe Olufashinu, and then probably J.C. Latham and maybe Amarius Mims. I think Mims and Newton may be a lot closer for NFL teams' boards than what we maybe thought even a month ago. But if it comes down to that, and it's just those, 4 guys, and then you're not sure of Fautanu or Fuaga, I think that's when we get into that scenario of, okay, so maybe he's a little bit higher. Maybe he's right on that cusp of 18, and they needed to be sure about him before they make that selection.
Well, I wonder where he is compared to a guy like Brock Bowers.
Sure.
That's the name you didn't mention. You mentioned all those tackles, and we spent a lot of time in that big board stacking exercise trying to figure out where is Brock Bowers related to these tackles. We decided we think he's ahead of most of the tackles for the Bengals. We think, but if perhaps plan A is still offensive tackle and maybe all the offensive tackles get scooped up quickly as the 6 players picked before 18 you mentioned scenario plays out, maybe that's a scenario where Bowers falls. Still think that his floor might be 15, judging from what people have said about the Colts in this process all along. But do you have any feel there, Joe, Bowers, Newton, how that stacks up, or should we just transition and start talking about another position group here?
Well, I think this does transition to another group. So like, what guys would they also have in that grouping of, we hope he's there at 18 or would consider them? And is Bowers in that group? I think he probably is, but is he ahead of a guy like, so let's say I saw a mock today with Olufashinu falling still to 18. Like, I would have Olu over Bowers, right? I think that's a top tackle. I think the Bengals would go that position. Would they take Byron Murphy, who's probably a lot higher than we thought, than a month ago? And I think they'd have Byron Murphy. So if Murphy and Bowers are both there, I think they would go Byron Murphy. So this is breaking a lot of hearts, I think, for the weapons people out there that really love Brock Bowers. But those two are really strong prospects in the trenches that are probably harder to find those positions. You typically have to draft those positions earlier than you do tight end. So it makes a lot of sense, I think, to transition to the next position. What if there is a cornerback 1 still available for the Bengals at 18?
It's a perfect tease. We will answer that question coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle, level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for the first time. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.
As we were transitioning to corner, one of the things that I thought was interesting as we're talking about some of those guys that may or may not be available to the Bengals is I was looking back at some of those 2024 too early mock drafts from a year ago, and Newton, Fashanu, both of those guys. I mean, Newton went 18 in the one I'm looking at SI.com. Fashanu is still a top 10 player. Of course, the Bengals in this one are picking like 28 and picking Malik Neighbors in this way too early mock from 2024. So a little Damn. Fun looking way back in the past there. Kingsley Sumatea going at 31 and that one looking a little bit prescient as well. So let's give credit to Luke Easterling from this Sports Illustrated mock draft that he put together with Caleb Williams, Marvin Harrison, Olu Fashanu, Drake May, Dallas Turner, Brock Bowers, all very early. And in addition to Joel Jared Verse. I mean, pretty on it for a year ahead of time. A lot of times these things look really silly a year later, but JC Latham 14 and Johnny Newton right there at 18. Interestingly, some of the corners we're about to talk about were not in the first round of this year too early, and this is one of those things that changes year over year. But Kool-Aid McKinstry was. Not that we're talking about Kool-Aid McKinstry, but we have mentioned in passing in the last month or two that cornerback is something that I think we've all thought the Bengals would consider at 18. We just have all thought for a while that it wasn't plan A or maybe even plan B. But perhaps, Joe, we should be paying more attention to the top of this corner class for a team that could use a dominant corner if one were available.
Yeah, it's funny because we've had so many warning stories of how the Bengals leave a position available until the draft and then they address it in the draft, right? The Billy Price years, and there's been others that they've done this, whether it's first round, second round, third round. They seem to attack the remaining needs that they've left open through free agency. And this year we kept saying, why haven't they signed a corner yet? Don't they need a veteran corner? Don't they need a guy that has played or can play when the fourth corner for them has played so much in the Zach Taylor era? He's been basically a starter because they've dealt with injuries every single year at that position. And then I get to this draft and we get to the end of the process. And, for our spreadsheet, Jake, these guys grade out incredibly high. The Quinyon Mitchell's out of Toledo, who is PFF's top corner, like grading wise for the last few years. His ball production is tremendous. He's got the length. He's got the athleticism. He tested like one of the best athletes, if not the best athlete of all the corners in this class when using a relative athletic score. And you're like, how is that guy not a top 12 pick? And then I saw Josh Norris mock today where Quinyon Mitchell's still there at 18. And who did he take for the Bengals? Quinyon Mitchell. And Charles Burks, their defensive backs coach, right, secondary coach, coached Quinyon Mitchell at the Senior Bowl down in Mobile, Alabama this year. So he got his hands on him. He knows exactly what he is. And we have to look at the Bengals roster as well. Do they have a cornerback one? Now, if you're a huge Cam Taylor-Britt fan, you're probably screaming right now, yeah, they do. It's Cam Taylor-Britt. Well, he's only played about 60% of the snaps his first 2 years. And I'm not sure the Bengals agree. Let's compare it to the wide receiver room from a couple years ago. Cam Taylor-Britt is probably the T. Higgins. Mike Hilton's the Tyler Boyd. They did not have a Jamar Chase. They like the receivers. They felt everyone in the league likes those two. But do you have a number one? You do not. And that's why they were so convinced and so felt so strongly to take a Jamar Chase as high as they did. I think the same scenario can apply to this. And yes, they just drafted DJ Turner. But the difference between DJ Turner and Cam Taylor-Britt and a guy like Quinyon Mitchell or even Terrion Arnold, and we should probably in passing continue to mention Cooper DeJean, Kool-Aid McKinstry, and who's the other one I'm forgetting?
Nate Wiggins.
Nate Wiggins, yes, of course, the guy that's been mocked by Jeff Hobson recently. Because if they're high enough on the Bengals board, and I'm expecting at least two of them to be, Mitchell and Arnold, those other guys could be knocking on that door as well. And is that the scenario where we end up in a Johnny Newton versus Terrion Arnold? And it's like, okay, here's two guys here that we really like. It's not what we expected. The draft went a little weird, but those are two really good players that really help elevate two positions on your defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I think that's a heck of a debate. So with that one, I think I would lean Newton, but what would they do? It would be tough. I would say getting after the quarterback would take the priority. And I do think there's some day three depth at corner that you could certainly like. At the same time, if it's Quinyon Mitchell, or maybe let's say Arnold goes ahead of him and goes ahead of Mitchell. Sure. Maybe that's the scenario where Mitchell makes it. But if it's Mitchell or Newton, I think they would take Quinyon Mitchell because he's kind of checked every box during this process. Newton hasn't. And I do think that could be part of the tiebreaker if there is a tiebreaker needed, and they may just have Mitchell well ahead of Newton on their board.
No, I agree.
Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
No, I agree. I had Mitchell when I was doing the rankings and trying to figure it out, just behind Fashanu, Byron Murphy, and then Quinyon Mitchell as like a premium position, top 12 type of prospect, that if he's still there at 18, I could see them even taking him over Brock Bowers, and that would make people freak out a little bit. But I think Mitchell provides them with something they don't have: instant starter, cornerback one potential. And yeah, he's coming from Toledo. It happens from the MAC once in a while, the Khalil Macks of the world, the Corey Davises that go in the top 10, right? Quinyon Mitchell has checked every box you said, passed every test that was in front of him, whether it was at the combine where he looked incredibly well, moving fluidly, standing out amongst guys that are at the tops of their position, maybe the freakiest athletes on football fields at corner in terms of that speed and agility and acceleration, but at the Senior Bowl as well, just completely locking down, rising to that challenge, and looking like a future corner one.
The last time the Bengals picked a player that wasn't an SEC, ACC, or Big Ten first-round player was John Ross, still a major conference. And before that, William Jackson from Houston. Before that, Cedric Ogbuehi. So they had a few years there where they went away from those big conferences. But since then, it's been...
You're not.
Well, no.
I actually think Quinyon Mitchell, pretty confidently, and this is coming from the John Ross guy, is a better prospect than all of those guys. There's no like huge, and I'm not saying you're comparing them, but just for everyone listening and watching, Ross had injury issues. Obviously, he was injured, and William Jackson, he was a good player, but it's not like he was the same level of cornerback prospect as Quinyon Mitchell.
No, we really liked him as a prospect. I'm just saying that in their since 2018, so what is that, 6 drafts? Ohio State, Alabama, LSU, Michigan, Clemson. Yeah. Big college football playoff type programs. And since Zach Taylor came to town, their first 2 picks in most years are college football playoff type teams. LSU, Clemson, Michigan, and then obviously Cam Taylor, Britt, Nebraska, not a CFP team. Clemson, Michigan in 2023, Alabama in the 3rd round. Like, they have leaned into those big schools, which is why Quinyon Mitchell is such an interesting conversation, because he is such a tantalizing prospect. And you're right, Joe, there are players like that come out of the MAC from time to time, but the Bengals typically haven't been the ones to take that swing. And that's why it's very interesting.
I will say, though, from a sample size, though, right, we're talking probably 90% of the first rounders are coming from those big programs or big conferences. And it's just a couple that usually squeak in from the, the Pac-12 or whatever it is called now, and the big whatever and the A whatever. Yeah. I don't know the conferences. You're getting me here, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And so the likelihood is for them to usually pick from that group. I mean, look at the guys we're talking about, the other prospects. It is kind of weird that we have, even though it's still the Big Ten, Illinois, Toledo.
Yeah,
it is a bit unique, but let's keep the conversation going with more first round conversation here, and maybe some other notes with Joe Goodberry coming up next. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime. The scoreboard isn't looking good. You're feeling low. You're not sure if you or your team can pull out a win. And that's when you dig deep. You lift your head up and you say to yourself, it's time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right. The smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and build the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but it's on your phone. You can play it anytime with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare progress to your friends. There's so much to do. You have countless dynamic Monopoly boards. You can make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboards. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play.
We've talked about corner. We've talked about Johnny Newton. Let's quickly hit on edge rusher, a position that we talked about last week, and then we'll talk a little bit about second, 3rd round, day 2 ideas.
No. Punish your voice.
Is there anything that has shifted in your estimation, Joe, since we last discussed edge rusher? Do we think there's a real chance that they would dip into that bucket, or are the outliers for age for Jared Verse and Laiatu Latu the tipping point there where you don't expect Dallas Turner to be available?
Right.
So are they really picking Chop Robinson that early in the first round ahead of some of these other guys we've talked about? Because if you're eliminating Verse and Latu for age reasons, both of them over the age of 23, those would be the guys you'd be thinking about.
Yeah, so you just took all my analysis because as I was plugging it into the sheet, I was like, oh man, they only draft ends that are young. Like of all the positions, this is a strong correlation for them. And Chop Robinson, at the same time we were having the conversation about them bringing in Robinson for a visit, that was interesting. And yeah, he's the youngest guy of the grouping. And it's like, okay, maybe that's why they wanted to see where he's at, where, what he looks like in his development, how much room there is to grow. But that can't be at 18. Would that be the off the rails surprise pick? Oh, no doubt about it. I even think Tyler Guyton would be less of a surprise, of course. But yeah, I'm not in favor of doing any of those two. Not to put that into the universe. Maybe that's a trade back. Let's keep our eye on Chop Robinson because he checks our boxes.
Well, what about other potential surprises then at 18? Like you talked about Guyton and Chop Robinson there. And if I'm looking at the second round, there's some young guys at edge rushers that could surprise in the second round. Austin Booker, Jonah Ellis, the two younger defensive ends that could be day two guys. But what else would surprise you at 18 before we transition to day two?
Yeah, I think it would just be us spending more time talking about those other three corners. If it's Cooper DeJean, if it's Kool-Aid McKinstry, if Kool-Aid McKinstry is a high recruit guy that played as a freshman, still young, and checked the boxes every single year. He started at Alabama, big time program, has the athleticism, has the ball production, played in a sophisticated zone defense that should be able to translate very quickly. Look at his PFF grades. It's like rookie or freshman year is like a 75, then an 80, and then an 89. He just got better. I think people got tired of talking about him. He was the top 15 pick projected throughout. It was prophesized he was always going to be a top 15 pick. And now we're sitting there at 18 saying he's not worth it. I think a lot of teams are still going to have him. And if he goes top 16 or so, right at that cusp there, right before the Bengals pick, don't be shocked. And if the Bengals have a high opinion on him, I wouldn't be absolutely surprised.
Yeah, makes sense. It does. Like the cornerback, they've prioritized cornerback in the past couple of drafts. So the fact that they would be in at the top of this class, depending on who's there, would make a ton of sense. I think. Do you think they would go Nate Wiggins still, despite his weight? Like in a trade down scenario, let's say they moved down to 25 with the Packers.
They didn't care about the weight of Emmanuel Forbes, right? Like that was a guy we were all pretty sure they liked.
Sure, but you already have DJ Turner. Does it matter? Does it matter? I think that's the interesting, because you can only have so many guys that weigh less than James and Jake,
combined. Yeah. And so I agree. Maybe that's our own internal biases of.
I pretended that you were 120 pounds.
But yeah, I think that might be our own personal thing. Like when we get to receivers talking in a second here, that what we think they should have or what they should want or how they can maximize things. I would hope they would go with a bigger corner. Maybe that's a Cam Hart or somebody that could hold up a little bit more on the outside.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Pick 149, Cam Hart. All right.
Or a Quantez Stiggers, perhaps. Going to interest you? I'm going to just keep mentioning that name. That's 3 straight episodes.
How about you get them both? Hart round 5 and one of those 6th rounders, because they're not going to be able to trade them all.
And to finish the conversation on corner, it's kind of funny because like we're saying, hey, corner 1, they could really be into. Because it gets to the 2nd, 3rd round, we're talking about cornerback 2 and 3 types. Like, I don't know that the Bengals have to have that. I think it's more about the opportunity to get something that you don't have. Yes, they need a corner 4, but that can be 3rd round, 4th round, 5th round. Other than that, I think we're talking about it at 18 because these guys are special.
And the 2nd round corners that are projected right now are not guys that fit a lot of what we think the Bengals like, which is especially a priority on speed. Max Melton being one that stands out as a potential day 2 corner. And there's probably a couple others, but Max Melton has been the one throughout the process that's really stood out as far as the profile is concerned. But Joe, you hinted at it. We're going to talk about wide receivers again.
Yeah, baby.
Much to everyone who loves wide receivers talks joy. We have thought for a lot of time in this process that the Bengals would prioritize a wide receiver of some sort. Probably not in the 1st round. It's never seemed like that would fit. But if Rome Odunze falls, as a certain mock draft published on Monday suggested, I know which one it was, then maybe they would consider it. Looking at day 2,
they better. If that happens, they better. I'm just
yeah.
it's
I
only
mean,
comment
they
I'm
should
gonna
pick Roma Dunze.
Yeah,
if he's available,
and then trade T right away, right?
And then trade T right away
to get Olafashanu right there,
and then trade back up into the first round to get an offensive tackle or one of the, yeah, absolutely. We're talking fantasy land though. Let's talk about reality a little bit here.
sounds like we just got hired to be the GM of
Okay.
Come on.
We talked a lot about versatile receivers, and at times I've wondered, is that something that we want them to do so that Jamar Chase can play more in the slot and they can kind of align in more of an amoeba, or is that something we think that they will do, and that maybe instead they're looking at it like, we've got a hole at slot receiver, maybe we just need a slot receiver?
Yeah, the same way we've said that they've kind of left corner alone in free agency. They didn't address nose tackle. We know that, but you can't draft a nose tackle in the first 2 rounds typically unless they want to go completely rogue, which is one of my nightmare scenarios. Also, Mason Smith at 49. But yeah, if they want to address their open holes, I think wide receiver 3 being the slot guy is one of them. And yes, I still think that Andre Iosivas has a role on the team. Charlie Jones will have a role on the team, but we're talking about potentially 49, 80, 97 for those picks. Mm-hmm. Those are complete upgrades for what they drafted Charlie Jones and Andre Iosivas at, even though Charlie was a 4th round pick, was the end of the 4th round. So we're talking about a decent enough gap to where they could look at it and say, hey, we need to fill the slot position this year. Charlie didn't play it at Purdue or at Iowa or at Buffalo. Like, Andre Iosivas actually had more career snaps in the slot at Harvard or Princeton than Charlie Jones did. One of those Ivy schools. But
no, your
point is, he needed some development. Charlie needed some development inside. Just because he's white and sneaky fast doesn't mean he's just an automatic slot guy, right? You're shaking your head, but it's true. You get your hands on him, you get him in the room, and you go, oh, he actually needs to learn a little bit more than we thought he did, and he's already 25 years old.
And he told me that straight up. He's like, I'm way more comfortable outside, and I'm learning playing inside, which makes sense because there's a lot to learn when it comes to playing slot receiver.
So if the Bengals need a slot and view they need a slot and could find an upgrade in this class, that makes me more comfortable with this class, number 1, from a personal thing, because I look at it and say, hey, there's not a lot of number 1s or even maybe good number 2s, but there's a lot of solid 2s and good number 3s in this class. It's a good receiver class, but for what we could potentially need, the Bengals could need, it makes sense. So is that where we see them attack? And maybe the versatility is more of a bonus for the guys like Jalen McMillan or the Ricky Pearsalls, or is it, hey, we're going to have to kick Keon Coleman inside in the slot, but he can play a little bit outside stuff. He can be a jump ball receiver on the outside. TJ Hushman's used to get out there once in a while. They throw him deep balls and let him be a big box out type receiver. Can you do some of that stuff with Keon Coleman? Or is it like, and I think that's why when we go over these mock drafts, sometimes we don't target those slot only, the Roman Wilsons, right? We kind of bypass them looking for more versatility, but I don't know if we're actually correct on that. And maybe they would value like a guy like Roman Wilson that is just a slot, but you know what, he can play slot and he can play it this year for us.
It's interesting that you mentioned Roman Wilson specifically at 5'10", give it 5'11" nearly, when you consider their history of the type of player they've drafted, even to play in the slot.
Yeah, I agree that typically they like bigger guys, whether that's from TJ Hushmanzada, Mohamed Sanu, or then Tyler Boyd. They want the bigger guys that, because they're going to be a 3 wide receiver team, you need that guy to block a little bit. You need him to dig out those nickel corners and safeties. That's why I think Keon Coleman still at 49 makes a ton of sense for them. And then when I start to get to the Jalen McMillans and the Ricky Pearsalls and say, yeah, I could see them seeing that as a slot with plus versatility.
Can my guy Luke McCaffrey get a little love? How about him at 115? I mean, 6'1". He's got the size, 198. I mean, he doesn't weigh less than Lisco or Rapine or Goodberry for that matter. McCaffrey's ready to go.
Yeah, I think Brendan Rice as well in that range from the 97 to 115. You know, these guys fit as guys that you may have to convert them inside, but yeah, I think they're both going to be slot receivers at their best in the NFL.
I wonder also if what am I trying to say? Zach Taylor has not drafted a slot receiver, is what I'm trying to say. So when we think about their trends at receiver, they did draft obviously T. Higgins, a bigger guy who's always going to play outside. They drafted Jamar Chase, whose size doesn't matter because of the way he plays football and his level of athleticism, and they drafted a couple of day 3 wide receivers. We haven't seen them aggressively target a slot receiver. So maybe we are reading too much into the size issue that's led me to dismiss the Roman Wilson types, the slot onlys that are a little bit smaller, the Malik Washington, Taj Washington, and I mean they spent a lot of time with Jacob Cowing, Arizona, who's 5'8", 168 at his pro day. So maybe that is a little bit of an overread.
Back to lighter than us, just for those wondering.
Mm-hmm.
You think they're in on Malachi Corley, Joe?
That is an interesting one. Yeah, maybe that's another guy too, who's a lot of slot, Deebo Samuel versatility in terms of backfield things. And he's got a lot of fun tape because they manufacture a lot of touches for him, but I think you may have to. And what does that do for guys like, will Kyle Shanahan, to bring up a Deebo? Will Kyle see him as, oh, this is a guy I can use, no doubt. Whereas Zach Taylor, who isn't, well, I wouldn't say that completely. I was going to say who isn't scheming guys open consistently. I would say that they're prioritizing scheming open Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd and the guys they've had. But if Malachi Corley ends up being your number 2 option in a year or two, yeah, you could see a way where they're like, yeah, we know how to get the ball into his hands. And they don't have another screen guy, right? They don't have another yak guy other than Jamar Chase. And that's a big issue in this offense. When you're getting those umbrella cloud coverages, defenses are saying, okay, check it down and see if we can come tackle you. And the Bengals don't have anybody to make you miss or run through your face. And guys like Malik Washington, Malachi Corley, while small and shifty, they'll take that ball and they'll run right through a corner's face and try and run them over and run through them and bounce around them and stay on their feet and gain extra yardage. Yeah, the Bengals could use that. So I'm not completely against it. And if they recognize that same need, yeah, I could see it happening.
The other thing, I just want to mention it before I forget. Last year, obviously, they go slot with Charlie Jones, and they projected him to be a slot. And then they go get Andre Yosevach, 2 guys that they showed interest in, or at least one guy that you like a lot, Joe, Jalen Coker out of Holy Cross, late 6th round, 7th round, Josh Cephas. They've developmental outside guys and prioritize the guy that's actually going to play and make an impact on day 2 of the draft.
Yeah, I could see that. It's the wide receiver, the double dip situation. Now, you have Trenton Irwin, who's probably one of your top 5 or 6 guys, right? So it depends on how many you draft. If that guy in the end, if Jalen Coker makes the roster, or is that, I don't know if we knew that Andre Yosevach was going to make the roster either until they get here in camp and they're like, oh, the guy can play. And then this year, especially.
He beat out Stanley. He beat out Stanley Morgan,
who's been a fixture on the team for a long time. But you're not going to have T. Higgins in camp more than likely, right? We don't expect him to show up until a week before the first game, let's say, based on how Jesse Bates' situation went and how typically franchise tag situations go. So if you only draft a slot guy this year, you're going to be rolling out there with Jamar Chase, that slot guy, Charlie Jones, Andre Yosevach, and Trenton Irwin on the outside replacing T. Higgins, and trying to run a full functioning camp in the summer with that. Not ideal. So there is a scenario here where, yeah, you may want to spend, even if it's a 3rd or 49 and then a 4th round, 39 and then a 5th round, or 49, I meant to say, and then a 5th round. Yeah, I could see them double dipping and adding to that room because you're going to need it throughout the summer.
Joe, appreciate the time and insight as always as we talk about some of the things we think the Bengals might do. Reading the tea leaves here on Locked On Bengals, getting mystical with it right before the draft. That's going to do it for this episode. Find his show, Bengals on the Brain, on the First Star Logistics YouTube channel. Until next time, we'll do a predictive mock draft here on Locked On Bengals. What James
10 receivers
the Bengals will do on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday this week. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.